this is the real moment of the day, hearing from three amazing people. Dawoud, Lisa, Darren, thank you for being here. And maybe we'll just start with that big question, which is, what do you think of when you hear art with a conscience?
Well, it's interesting because I think the question or the issue of conscience in this context, for me, has to do with a notion of citizenship, a kind of conscience that grows out of engaged, active, and intentional citizenship, principled citizenship, which I think extends individually, and of course, because museums are in fact made up of groups of individuals who have a kind of common cause in art objects and art and its place in culture, to work to fuse that notion of conscience or engaged citizenship into the institutional fabric. So that's how I think about that. I don't think about conscience in the abstract. It's more a question of, having a sense of conscience as a part of active citizenship and engaging institutions in that notion of active citizenship through different programmatic strategies.
It's beautifully said. How about you, Lisa?
First, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for being here, and it's so wonderful to look out. Can you hear me all? It's so wonderful to look out and to see people's faces again. It's so unusual. It's lovely to move up here onto the stage and to see all of you, and it's quite wonderful. I guess art with a conscience for me, further to that, it's the idea of inclusion and of everyone feeling like they have a voice in the institutions, or that they can see themselves in those institutions. So I really enjoyed your fireside chat, talking about how to, about outreach and the problematic of how do you reach on a national basis across so many different cultural veins. And so I guess for me, it's just, even that's a concept now, and that it's part of the core dialogue about how do people across all walks of life and all communities feel engaged in their institution, be it at a local, regional level, or to feel like they have a say and a voice and a place in the national institutions.
Well, I find it curious that the panel even has that title. What does it evoke? I mean, that museums have not had a conscience? That museums have not been conscious of certain things that museums should be conscious of? I think that's what both of these amazing artists have spoken so eloquently about. I think museums have become contested spaces in part because they have lacked a full awareness. The awareness to truly fulfill the mission. Most museums are educational institutions, are chartered as educational institutions, certainly in the United States. And so the question of how do you educate the public in a democracy like the United States? How are you conscious as an institution of the ways in which you engage, you represent? Are you conscious of the full range of excellence in the arts. And I think that's part of where this, the challenge of what are museums conscious of and what have they not been conscious of. So I'm very interested in that question, because I think that question and an engagement and excavation of that question will lead museums to greater excellence and a greater both awareness and embrace of the full range of great art that is being created and the artists who are doing it. It's hard for me now to imagine that museums weren't conscious of Sam Gilliam's genius early in his career, just as with other peers of his who museums were very conscious of. It's interesting to me that there were so many amazing women painting, but it seemed that the establishment of critics and gatekeepers were conscious of only one woman a decade, it seems. I mean, it was, you know, Joan Mitchell, 1 decade, and then we waited another decade, and Agnes Martin came along, and then we waited another. Where was the consciousness about the amazing work that was being created by these women, by Alma Thomas, by so many women we could all name, who received very little awareness, very little recognition, very little consciousness of their excellence. And so I just think for me, this is really a question of how do we seek excellence everywhere it is in the art world, and bring that into our great museums.
Love that.
Yeah, thank you all. I'm actually going to ask a related question, but I'd love to talk explicitly about social justice. And I know from conversations with my colleague museum directors that I think if you asked the Association of Art Museum Directors, is social justice core to what a museum does or should do, that you'd get a spectrum of responses, from some who say it has no place at all, none at all, to people who say it's central to a museum. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about the role of museums in social justice work. And maybe, Darren, I'll start with you, since your foundation is focused on justice.
I just think this is a really fraught idea that some have seemed to attach to me and to my institution. The notion that museums are social justice institutions. Museums are educational institutions. If they are achieving their objectives as educational institutions, there will actually be a more just society. So I don't think that a museum director, and as you know, many of your colleagues rightly have said, I didn't get a PhD in Renaissance paintings to be a social justice leader. I'm a museum director. I was never trained. Why would you now expect me to morph into something else? And so I actually am sympathetic to some of our colleagues who have said that to me. And I actually don't have that expectation that they should morph into social justice leaders. I do think, however, that museum leaders need to have an awareness of how the world in which they are presenting art is evolving, and how that world is a world that is increasingly unequal, that is increasingly more contested, particularly in terms of identity. And the work of museums is to play back to a society who you are. And I think the challenge and what has been unjust is that museums told a story that was not full, right? So you can't have, I love the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but it is inexplicable to me that you can have a museum with an American wing and the Native collection, the Native American collection, is in what used to be, in the old days, called the primitive collection. So it was in Oceanic and Africa, right? So the Native American collection is not in the American wing. There's something to me that's not a political, I mean, it's not wokeness. I mean, it's like, we're Americans. Aren't they American? You've got them in the museum. What would prevent you from organizing your thinking as to what great American art looks like? I mean, you got this Georgian furniture and Gilbert Stuart and Peale and all sorts of American art, but that you wouldn't see that. To me, so the issue of justice in part is emerged because it seems so unfair and unjust that museums haven't been willing to fully embrace the story of who we are.
Thank you. Lisa, thoughts on the role of museums in social justice, if there is one?
I love sitting beside you. Oh. The two of you gentlemen, this is fabulous. In our culture, we are canoe people, and we lived in longhouses. You'll notice I'm really careful when I choose my words. I'm really appreciative of how clear you state your ideas, and because we lived in longhouses and because we traveled in canoes, we had to be very diplomatic. I'm also an elected member of our governing body now, so I now maneuver through the
You're
political.
a good politician.
I now maneuver through like the political spectrum and the art spectrum, and so I love what you're saying, because for me I agree. It's just the awareness of the injustice that has just existed for so long without anybody, from my point of view, from someone from the farthest part of Canada, from this small island, where it didn't seem like we had a voice. And so to be here, to be graciously thought of, to be included, to me speaks of a natural turning towards making things just or right that haven't been for a long time. I mean, I checked this morning in Canada, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, Native American, we didn't get the vote until 1960. So it's not that long ago that we were so marginalized and othered that we would not what we created would not have been thought of in terms of being displayed in an institution of art where we weren't in a primitive designation. Do you know?
But your goal is not. I think part of what people recoil at is it's as if we are saying, shame on you, you bad museums people. You're just terrible, and you ought to feel guilty and really bad. That's not the message. That's not the message. The message is that was then. I mean, the context was the context, and it is deeply regrettable, just to be clear. I'm not sort of saying, oh, that didn't happen and let's just move on. I'm saying it was horrible, and it was racist, and it was gendered, and it was all of those things which were real and which were a completely normal part of our culture. It's unfortunate and deeply regrettable, as you say. I mean, African Americans didn't really, I'm from the South, we didn't really participate fully in our democracy until 1964 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So we couldn't vote in my little town. But that was then. So let's learn from that. And so this isn't an indictment that you're just horrible, irredeemable institutions. It's saying, how do we learn from this history? Acknowledge that we didn't do our jobs fully. We missed the boat on fill in the blank. But we as institutions are committed now to doing better. And to me, that needs to be our focus. Not on flagellating people over, something that happened 100 years ago. And so, yeah, that's how I see it.
I have to agree. Bruce Hageman, hi. Earlier this morning we were talking about, he asked how I was doing, and I said, I'm doing very well, because I try really hard to move through life and my practice with immense gratitude. So this conversation, I have to agree with you, it's not about saying what was done wrong and people should atone, but just that it's such a wonderful time and place to be in now, to be participating in these conversations and this awareness, because I think if you're aware of what has happened previously, then you're aware that there was injustice and that everyone wants to try a new way of including everyone's voices. So I think it's not a condemnation, but just an acknowledgement, and that this is a brand new way that we're all forging together.
Thank you. Dawoud?
And I think this question of what is now called, in this particular moment, social justice, which for me is a larger question really of equity, because social justice is a particular language that people presume comes attached to a particular agenda, when the larger issue, I think, is the issue of equity. What fundamental equity looks like. And, Darren mentioned, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is through the Met, that I have been thinking about the questions that we are raising for a very long time. Actually going back to, interestingly enough, when I was 16 years old. I wouldn't have framed it the way we're framing it now, but my thinking and my relationship to the museum space as it relates to its larger community began with the Harlem on My Mind exhibition. And that was 1969. And again, the museum had mounted an exhibition. The best way to sum it up is that the museum had mounted an exhibition without the input of the community that the exhibition was about. And the museum had held several meetings with the community that turned out to be only symbolic at best, because none of the inputs that the members of the Harlem community and ultimately a larger community of cultural workers raised was implemented in the construct of the exhibition. And it was the controversy around that, because mind you, it's 1969 in America, 1968, 1969, a moment of profound social revolution in which people are speaking back to institutions in power of all kinds, including museums. So this is not a new conversation. What drew me to the museum actually was not even the exhibition, but the controversy surrounding the museum and this particular exhibition about an African American community. And ultimately, and I'll try to, make it brief. Two organizations, the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition which was founded by the artist Benny Andrews and other artists, and then a more broad-based organization of art workers called the Art Workers Coalition mounted protest in front of the Met. This in itself was so controversial, it was being talked about on talk radio, local media, and being very socially and politically active even at that young age. I went to see not the exhibition, which may have been a secondary thought. I went to see the controversy. I might have even had an idea about jumping on the picket line. I'm not sure. Which would have been more of a thought than going into the museum to see the exhibition that had provoked this controversy. But ultimately, that became a profoundly meaningful moment for me because, as it turns out, on the day that I went to see this controversy in the picket lines, they were not there, which left me with the dilemma of what do I do? And I figured I'd come all the way from Queens into Upper Manhattan, so I went in to see the exhibition and to see people looking at pictures of ordinary African Americans on the wall of a museum. That kind of began to set my own agenda, which again, at 16, I would not have articulated, but it's exactly what I've done for several decades now. So these two things kind of happened in equally profound ways. One, the notion that the museum is not a benign institution of space, that it can and should be engaged, that it can be challenged, it can be spoken back to, it can be held accountable to the larger, I guess we could say, social ecosystem that all museums are in fact a part of. And that notion of the museum not being a benign space and being a space that can be spoken to, engaged, challenged, worked with, having a conversation with, has pretty much been central to my own notion of what the museum is and how I choose to engage with it. But this question of social justice, equity, it goes back at least decades because of the history-based work that I'm doing now. I would say some of the American problematics around issues of race certainly are kind of foundational to what this country is, But this notion of the museum as a space that can be actively engaged, challenged by the community in which these institutions fit in is something that, for me anyway, goes back to that moment at the Met in 1969.
But don't you think that what happened then is so fundamentally different? You're right that this isn't, it is not new for museums to be caught in this dynamic of external pressures, particularly around inclusion and justice. The response then was both the Met and the Whitney, as you know, also had demonstrations. You probably participated in those too, and the Whitney, of course, right? But what they did was they engaged in tokenism. So the Met bought a Benny Andrews. The Whitney bought a Faith Ringgold. I mean, they said, well, these people are out front marching and they're causing problems and they're saying we don't. So buy a couple of pieces, and get them off our backs so we can get back to doing what we do here, which is what they did. And in fact, what was interesting to me in this conversation with Adam Weinberg was how they found in their warehouse these works they bought during that era that they'd never shown.
Exactly.
They just bought them because they could then say, no, we bought some black artists. What are you talking about, Faith? We bought one of your pieces. You haven't seen it on the walls yet, but it will come. And so I think part of what's changed now is that museums are internalizing the critique, and that the actual structures of museums, beginning with the most fundamental of structures, governance, the board, nothing changes in any institution, and most certainly in museums, without the board, leadership from the board, engagement from the board, and that we have never seen until recently. And we know, I mean, I will brag on Kaywin because I am fortunately a trustee of the National Gallery of Art, and I can say, certainly as the Black, queer first of my categories on that board, there is no doubt. I mean, I remember after a few board meetings, Sharon Rockefeller taking me aside and saying, oh my gosh, since, there's only 5 trustees, and so one trustee can make a big difference. And she said, the conversation around the board table has completely changed. I mean, you and Kaywin, it's just a completely different conversation. And I've heard that at other places and spaces where people say, actually, having a more diverse board has made us more conscious. It has made us more aware, and it's actually will make us more excellent, because we will be a weaker board in 2025, 2030, 2040, if we have the level of consciousness that we have had in the past about all of the issues that are going on in our society, in the world of art and creatives. And so I think that for me, again, I always, I was trained as a lawyer, and unfortunately, at least in the US context, this issue of diversity is so problematic. It's so fundamentally problematic because we were introduced to the idea of diversity in a really unfortunate context, which I don't care what anybody says, it's still in the back of the minds of a lot of people. It was a legal case in 1978. Alan Balke sued the University of California because he was denied admission to the University of California Medical School. And blacks with lower MCAT scores were admitted over him. The Supreme Court held that it was actually constitutional because of the state's compelling interest in diversity in a democracy to allow blacks with lower scores to be admitted over a white man with higher scores. That was how diversity was introduced into our entire lexicon and consciousness. And so when you say diversity, I don't care what anybody says, there is in the minds of a lot of people in this country a sense that this is lowering our standards. This means we have to let in people who aren't qualified, who aren't going to meet the standards of, and so it's deeply regrettable because when I think about across many of the areas that we fund at the foundation and many initiatives that we funded, diversity was just so fraught I remember conversations with Peter Gelb about why hasn't there been at the Metropolitan Opera, a black librettist, there's no one. Well, along comes Terrence Blanchard, and I remember this conversation. Well, there's some of my trustees who are really a little worried that it's not going to meet the, and of course, what does he do? Fire Shut Up My Bones was, they could not extend it anymore because it was running into some Verdi production or something. But the point is, excellence was in the Metropolitan Opera every night. Mostly black singers not doing Porgy, representing excellence to the most diverse audience they've ever experienced. And my view on this is if you want opera as an art form in America to be relevant in the future and to be excellent in the future, yes, we need Verdi, absolutely. We need all of the classics, but you gotta also figure out how you do this. And no one is gonna say that a Mark Bradford show or a Kara Walker show is not excellent or doesn't bring crowds in. So to my mind, I think we have to talk about, I don't talk about diversity, I talk about excellence, because I think we all want excellence. And we need to move out of a lot of normative, canonical thinking about what constitutes excellence, because that's what really holds us back.
Mm-hmm. I love that there was going to be a round of applause.
Oh, no.
Because Because excellence was a bit of a bad word for a while, and I love this notion that we're redefining it and broadening it.
Not politically, though, just to be clear, because there are people who say, oh, we want to redefine excellence because of No, we don't. We want to redefine excellence because we will discover more excellence when we open our minds to believing that a group of women in rural Alabama can make beautiful art out of quilts. And this G-Spend thing is not some primitive craft, folk art kind of a thing that allows us to put that over there in a category and for what we do to be fine art. That's the problem that I have about the thinking that says, well, that's what we're doing over here is fine art. I was in a city, I won't say in the South, recently, and the museum is the Museum for Fine Arts. Why do you need to call yourself a museum for fine arts? Because you're in the South. And because I'm sorry, it's a South, I'm sure I'm gonna get in trouble on Twitter, but because you need to say that, because you need to make sure that in your insecurity about what is fine art and that you're not some, backwater hillbillies, that you actually understand that only fine art is what comes into your museum.
I think this is the part where I say, we don't do that in Canada. We have our own problems, though. And I want to keep your optimistic, forward-moving momentum and maybe start with Lisa and ask, given this moment, and this moment where more voices are invited and you feel part of it, what do you feel has been possible in your own practice that you maybe couldn't have imagined doing earlier on in your life?
It's a great question. We don't have my slides up. My great-grandmother was Isabella Edenshaw, and she has, some of her weavings are here at the Museum of Natural History. They're in many museums in the world. So when I grew up with these, do you know that my great-grandfather was Charles Edenshaw, and for those of you that don't know, these are both very strong examples in my culture and within Canadian culture of excellence in not just Indigenous art, but in the art world. And so when they were alive, museums would send emissaries to our island in the north, which, if you can imagine, that far, more than 100 years ago, that it was quite a trek to go there. And so I grew up with, I don't think that's my grandmother's. Do you want to? Can we go? There we go. So on your left is Nani Isabella Edenshaw, and so her weaving was so fine that they're like, I don't know how to describe the thickness. It's incredible. It's made out of spruce root. Her weaving, the roots of a tree, and the roots of a tree, something so organic that has been subsequently handled in such a manner that they become as even and consistent that each piece that she wove together would make these exceptionally fine hats. On your right-hand side is my great-grandmother, Selena Paradovich, who was from Haida, Gwaii, and Alaska. I should describe to you, I'm part of the Haida Nation, which existed before the current countries of Canada and the US. So I sit here today sort of as this interesting, we talk about the relations between Canada and US, and I always think of myself as actually without a border, because I belong first to the Haida Nation, which was there before the border. So Nani, Selena lived in both Haida, Gwaii and in Alaska. And so when you ask, what in my practice do I see now? I feel a little bit as though I'm not the best person to answer, because I was lucky enough, I understand, as an adult, when so many people did not have opportunity in my culture, in Indigenous cultures and many marginalized cultures, my Nani Selena would come from Alaska to harvest spruce root when I was, I think, 3. And when her daughter would come, Dolores Churchill, her daughter, my one earliest memories of Nani Selena was sitting with her. She called me over to stand by her knee while a camera crew filmed her. And these women would come to Haida Gwaii and they would harvest spruce roots, and they would teach me about stewardship of the land. And then we would say, where are you going next? And they would be off to Germany to teach, or off to Russia. So I'm happy to be here with all of you, and it's wonderful after COVID to see you all again. And it also, in my practice, doesn't seem unusual, because I was lucky enough to have these women that as I grow older, that I'm so grateful for, because they were just like, we are going to do this. We are going to preserve this culture. We're going to share it. We're going to teach it. We're going to speak of it outside of our community at large, to the world at large. So I'm grateful for the opportunities that I have, but I feel like I'm part of this continuity that these women established. That meeting you was, just another step in my journey that I'm grateful for, but that I wasn't. I learned to try to not be surprised by. It's like, like I was waiting for you, and then it was like, and there she is. Do you understand, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it makes lots of sense.
So I don't question. I find when I question things too much, I get in trouble. I start, then doubt seeps in, and then things don't go so well.
Thank you for that. Dawoud, how about you? I feel like you'll
There was a
answer.
question?
Yeah. Well,
What
Kaywin's
was it?
going to ask you a new question.
Okay. I'd like to return to the conversation that Sasha and I were having earlier about looking to artists working in the past, and how inspirational we find it. And Dawoud, I love your phrase that I've heard you say, that history is always present. I wonder if you and Lisa, I know your work, you say, is so profoundly influenced by people before you, if you could both talk about the role of history and historic art in your work.
Well, I have for 10 years, going back to 2012, with my Birmingham work, and I know we have a few slides of it. I have with my Birmingham work been directly addressing this notion of making history in relation to the African American piece of American history, both visible and resonant. Engaging the question of how does one make the past resonate in the contemporary moment. So that has been my challenge for the past. That's been my challenge with a very specific focus since 2012. I'll take a very brief detour because, quite frankly, my first project, Harlem, USA, from 1975 to 79, which was mounted at the Studio Museum in Harlem, is also about my history, my own very personal history. My mother and father used to live in Harlem, and then when I came along, they moved out to Queens for a little bungalow in Jamaica, Queens. And that work came out of wanting to reconnect with a piece of my history that I had not actually extensively experienced. Even though, because we had family and friends still there, I had a very close connection to that community. So I guess this notion of history has been an undercurrent that has run through pretty much all of my work. That as I've gotten older, I've realized exactly that. But the Birmingham work, the Birmingham project, it came about, I can't remember how long before I started the project, but in I was 11 years old. So in 1964, my parents brought home a book called The Movement. And it is a book of photographs of and about the civil rights movement. They got the book. James Baldwin came to speak at our church in Queens. And afterwards, they were selling this book, The Movement, as a fundraising vehicle for the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. So Baldwin may have actually been on a book tour for that book. I'm not sure. But they brought the book home and didn't talk to me much about it. My father expressed his opinion about Baldwin. He said Baldwin was a little strident. And then they just left the book on the coffee table in the living room, figuring if they told me I needed to look at it, I would probably, 11-year-old, I need to do it, I'm not gonna, So looking through the book, there was one picture. There were a number of really violent pictures, lynching photographs, and a number of photographs that really struck me to my core. But there was one picture of a young girl lying in a hospital bed with these two gauze bandages covering her eyes. And she was the sister, she's Addie Mae Collins, who was the older sister of one of the 4 girls killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And she had been in the girls' room along with her other friends, but she was not as close to the site as where the dynamite had been planted as the other 4 were. So she survived and was wounded, ultimately losing sight in one eye. And seeing that picture, I kind of mark my life before that picture and my life after. Really, it had that profound an effect on me. I don't know that at the moment I intuited that it might have been because I was very close in age to that young girl. So that picture never left me. I just kind of pushed it far to the back in some place in my psyche and then pushed it down. But then one morning, I was lying in bed, and I never really knew what that expression meant until then, to sit bolt upright. I literally sat bolt upright in bed as if someone had smacked me on the back of the head, and that picture was right there. So I knew I had to go to Birmingham. I had to do something with this, because this had been, I was 11 when I first saw it. I was probably 60 when that happened, or maybe 55, I don't remember. But it was several decades. And so I'd never been to Birmingham, Alabama before. Of course, knew the history of the movement in Birmingham. And so I scheduled a trip, a weekend trip, to go to 16th Street Baptist Church, to go to the site where this traumatic incident had occurred. And it was a very interesting visit, because mind you, I'm going decades later with the memory of 1963 that I'm carrying into this situation. And it's not 1963, of course, but this is the piece of history that has resonated for me. And on the way out, I had a conversation, brief conversation, with the minister who was at the back door greeting people as they left. And he asked me where I was from, what I was doing, and I told him. And what he said to me really jolted me into the present moment and made me realize this is not the museum of 1963's trauma. You know, he told me what his mission was. And so I decided I needed to make some work there. And so I did, and this kind of brings us back to this museum conversation. I did what I had been doing for decades in making my work. I contacted the Birmingham Museum of Art and told them I had an idea, because ultimately I wanted to mount an exhibition of this work, but I didn't want to just go there and mount it. You know, I wanted to, as I had been for a long time, engage the museum in a conversation about this history, to engage the museum in a conversation about this history with their community. Because mind you, in 1963, when that tragic event occurred, like most public institutions, the Birmingham Museum of Art was a segregated institution. Black people could not visit the Birmingham Museum of Art, except on one day that was designated as Negro Day. There was a Negro Day when African Americans, if they wanted to visit the museum, could go. And so I just reached out to the museum with an idea, because I've been partnering with, having conversations with museums about just this kind of thing. How can I work with the museum to realize a project, but also as part of that project, to engage the museum in a set of transformed relationships with any number of communities. The immediate community, a community of young people, young people who were the ones actually who were killed in this. And so I just said, come on down and let's talk about it. I didn't even know what I wanted to do, but that's the way I begin the conversation around my work. I have an idea. I'd like to come and talk to you. Let's see if we can do this. Tell me if you might be interested. I'll go back and, if you're interested, come up with a more detailed plan. And also a kind of conceptual frame for what I wanted to do, because I was going down there to talk to them, but absolutely no idea of how to translate that traumatic history into some compelling kind of work. And so that began the conversation, and ultimately the museum came on board about 2 years before what was going to be the 50th year of that tragedy. They thought that would be the perfect time to mount the exhibition that we agreed to do. And then working with their education department and working with a number of stakeholders in the Birmingham community. And it was not, given that for the adults, that was a once segregated institution, it took some serious relationship building, because, I mean, who am I coming from Chicago representing that museum, that big white museum downtown? You know, I had to work through this notion of being a kind of front man for the museum. And now you're showing up. I mean, who are you? We never heard from them. And now you're coming here. What's really going on? But ultimately, as the project took shape and those relationships and the confidence level of the community in participating in this, knowing that it was also going to be an exhibition at the museum, which is also a part of the shape of the project, this kind of deterritorialization of the institutional space, which I know is ultimately, going to be one of the end results and goals. So the conceptual shape was to make portraits of young African Americans who were the exact same age as those 6 young African Americans who were killed that day. Most people don't know about the 2 boys who were killed in the aftermath of the bombing of the church that killed the 4 girls. There were 2 boys killed in separate acts of racist violence that same day, that afternoon. So the shape of the work was to make portraits of those young African Americans who were the same age as those 6 African American youngsters who had been killed that day. And I kept thinking further. I wanted to give a sense of time, sense of loss, absence, passage of time. And then I began to seek out adults who were the ages that those young people might have been. And of course, looking back, those adults were actually present at the moment of the dynamiting of the church 50 years prior. So photographing them separately and then putting them together in the form of these diptychs to create what ultimately became the work. Most of the people did not know each other before I brought them together in 2 different locations. I was photographing in the museum, which I've done on several occasions, turn the museum into a studio rather than the place where the work is shown. The museum can actually be a place where the work is produced, and the work can later be shown. Just playing around with this idea of what the museum is and what it can be for me as an artist, and engaging the museum, I guess you could say, in this radical act of self-expansion. I mean, I come and I don't want to just do an exhibition. I want to make work with the community that you're in. There's a lot of things I want to do. And yeah, at the end of the day, we have an exhibition too, but the shape of the work would be larger than just that. Because for me, that's too consistent with how the structure of museums and the relationship between artists and museums work. Artists, we want to do an exhibition with you. And of course, as an artist, you're honored to do it, but given my own inclinations, that's not enough. I want to shake things up and make some other things happen, and make the museum do things they don't normally do, and to leave the museum with a transformed set of relationships, an audience that comes, that hasn't come, that have now come because the nature of the work somehow engages them in a very active way. But the Birmingham project, and of course a number of the adults, when they came to the museum to be photographed, was in itself very interesting, because I could tell from the way they came in, looking around like this, I could tell they'd never been in that museum before. And now not only are they in the museum, but they're being photographed. And did you say my picture's gonna hang in this museum too? So there's a whole different set of relationships being created. But I think I'll stop. But that's just one example of how I have, for myself and for the institution, reimagined the shape of what the museum can be and how it can be made to function in a way that goes beyond the conventions of how we think about museums. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't say that I'm happy to be sitting here with both of you, because I'm represented in your institution, and I've had an exhibition at yours. So I think that should be acknowledged as well.
Thank you, and congratulations. It was really an important and powerful work. I know we're almost out of time, but Lisa, history is so important in your work too. I'd love to get your thoughts.
As you've seen from my grandmother's pictures, oh, thank you for the respite from that light. It's so important because I think when I was, oh, there's the light again. When I was, like I said, when I was 3, 4, you know, when these, my great-grandmother would arrive, they would hand me, people said, what are your earliest memories of weaving? And I would just be handed a piece of spruce fruit, you know, and it was like this gentle introduction. I don't know whether they were seeing if my temperament would suit or not. But the way in which my practice, you know, harkens back or continues in the steps of my ancestors, when we would go out to harvest spruce root, we always, to this day, we bring fresh water with us. You go out and you find a stand of spruce root or spruce trees, and you peel back carefully a patch of the moss, and you only harvest so many spruce roots from each tree because you're aware of that the tree is gifting you something, and you want to leave as little damage as possible. So you take a few roots, and when you're finished, you carefully place the moss back, and we bring water to water the moss so it will try to regrow. And we always stop, in our language, thank you is ha'a. So we always stop and say ha'a to the tree in gratitude for the sharing that happens. So in my practice, there's this sense of history because this is what I've been taught about, that art practice is tied in with stewardship of the land and of place. And my practice, I've said this many times to anyone who will hear it, that my practice only continues as long as what is outside of my windows is in a healthy balance. So if I know that I can go and harvest seafood for dinner, if I know that, you know, that the trees are healthy, then I can continue because I know that around me there is stability and safety and nourishment. And that's all hand in hand with my being able to step up to a weaving to create it. So just so you know, the picture on the left-hand side is upside down. This is just to show you when I talk about weaving, that in the history of our weaving, it's not woven on a loom. We all woke up today and we all decided what we were going to put on. And textiles in the Western sense are generally fashioned on a loom where it's mechanized and the creation happens quite quickly of the textile. In our traditional teachings, it's literally, this is a piece of wood that's got a hole drilled every inch, and the warps, which are the backbone or the structural pieces of all the garments that you're currently wearing, those just hang freely. And then the wefts, which are woven on the horizontal, I weave every stitch independently on its own. So to complete a piece, which could be upwards of a year or more for a large-scale robe, when I weave a piece to make it, my words have departed from me for this moment, for it to be even on the sides and to be a square piece, there's the word. For it to be a square piece, I have to make sure that every single stitch for that year or more that I create is as identical to the one that precedes it and the one that will follow. And part of that is not being, feeling the safety and security of the environment around me, of which I am a steward, so that I might continue in this practice. You'll see an example. I generally weave robes. It's my preference to weave chief's robes, so large scale, 60-inch wide weavings that will take the 12, 14 months to create. But I'm also an urban indigenous person, and so we would go to events in Vancouver, and when you wear your traditional regalia, I will be in a spruce root hat, like the ones that have been woven by my great-grandmother. I'll be in a traditional robe. They're rather valuable, they're very precious to us, and you would finish the event, and then we do like to tend to go for a martini afterwards. And then we would be left, with our precious, wonderful regalia. And then the next time I would say, I'm not going to do that, and I would show up at the event, and I would feel like I was not honoring the time of took to organize the event, the people involved in the event. And so out of that came the idea of mantles, which you'll see on these personages that you will likely recognize. So it's a distillation of the robes and all they've meant for our people into a contemporary rendition. So taking that historical meaning and making it something that is has a more contemporary voice. Am I allowed to go back? I feel like the slides are up. There we go. Okay, this is the last one. In terms of the history in my pieces, you will see on your right-hand side, this is the Reigning Gold robe, which I created in a residency in Paris, and it now has been acquired by Global Affairs Canada for their collection. Traditionally, our robes are worn, as you can see, this is the presidential robe for the Council of the Haida Nation. Generally, we wear our robes. They indicate not just status or power, respect. And so the Reigning Gold robe, when Global Affairs Canada acquired it, they said we would like to mount it behind protective glass, and it will be stitched into place. And I had a very hard time agreeing to that, because the last piece of business when a robe is created is that it is not the final stitch, or we generally wrap the top header in fur. It's not the actual physical act of completing the robe, it's putting the robe on and dancing it. And in that moment of dancing the robe, the dance imbues the robe with movement and with life, and it begins its own journey. So I can look at this picture of the Reigning Gold robe and know intellectually that I created it, but it's gone on to its own journey and its own story. So historically we wore them, it was mounted behind glass, and I felt quite uncomfortable. And then it went to Abadakwane at the National Gallery of Canada, where the National Gallery asked me if it could come out from behind the protective glass, and I was like, no, it's going to be exposed. So my work is very traditional in most respects. I always sit and remember that I am in a very fortunate position to carry on this legacy of the ancestral weavings with contemporary veining when I feel comfortable and when it feels appropriate. So no matter what I create, I sit in that place of grounded respect for the ancestors and the teaching and the place in which I come from, but also recognizing that, that this changed my thinking of my own practice, of someone saying, could we take it from being what it represents culturally in how it's used to mounting it, and I really, though it was an adaptation for me, I so valued it, because I just finished a show. I think I've signed a non-disclosure agreement, so I can't say much. I work in film on occasion, and we just finished a show where it takes place in a New York apartment building, and we filled all of the walls with art. And one of the pieces of art was a very simple white background, and forgive me, the artist whose name I can't recollect, and it was simple black dots, evenly spaced, and it was such a serene piece. And so when we talk about works that are in, like that were previously in the primitive or called craft, and so yes, historically, that's what I believe that mine would have been called. I loved the idea of looking at my work framed and this piece and the same evocation of energy or peace, but that it is about mindset. It's about how you look at the piece, who the gatekeepers are. So this is a long ramble, my apologies, but that historically, I always try to honor where I come from while being open-minded for myself, what I'm influenced to do next, and where the external influence comes from that might change my path.
Thank you. I think it's, are we finished? Are we thanking? Thank you to our panel. Thank you all for being here today.
Darren and Lisa and Dawoud, you all believe in museums, and it means a lot to be on stage and hear about your hope for them. So appreciate your support and appreciate all of you being here as well.
Thank you. I want to say, Hawa, thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing your stories with such authenticity and candor and personal, just your personal narratives. I think that's what brings us all together today, and that's what art does, is allows us the opportunity to share our personal stories and to learn from each other and to create community, new communities that encompass many different people we may have never ever met before on our journey. So I hope that the 5 of you enjoyed your conversation as much as we all did. We feel very privileged because it was really pulling back the curtain and and having a real conversation about something I think that's so important to every person in this room. When we at CCAR came together to talk about this gala that we're hosting tonight and the celebration of 50 years, we thought about, what we really wanted to talk about, and that is about raising our consciousness, not only of the institutions, but of our communities and the people that surround us. So you really helped us on that journey. And I want to introduce myself after that long diatribe, but my name is Vicki Hageman, and I am a board member of CCAR and a longtime friend of CCAR. Bruce, my husband Bruce, and I had the great privilege of serving our country in Canada as ambassadors for the Obama administration. And art really became the connecting glue and fiber of our work and the way in which we discovered Canada, me on a personal level, and I hope the way Canada discovered us as well. We had an opportunity to bring a number of our amazing contemporary American artists to Canada to engage in dialogues that were authentic and real, just like this one, to talk about the things that are really not only the things that are in our heart, the things that connect us through the heart, not just about policy and politics, but about the heart. So I just want you to know that we are going to take away a lot of the things that you said today, and in our own individual thoughts and practices, and that in all sincerity, we really look forward to having more of these conversations, and that we hope that all of you will continue to engage in those as we move forward. So again, Hawa, thank you, and thanks to all of you for being here. Before we depart, I just wanted to say thank you to some other folks as well who really have made has helped to make this conversation possible. And that is BMO Financial Group, the Donner Canadian Foundation, RBC Foundation, TD, McCarthy Teralt, Tories, and Dorsey Whitney. And also I want to thank you, we talk about building community, I really want to thank you as well to our program partners, the Canadian Consulate General in New York, the Consulate General Toronto, the National Gallery of Art, Washington, the National Gallery of Canada, Ottawa, the National Arts Club in New York, and OCAD University in Toronto. And lastly, and very importantly, we want to thank the Museum of Modern Art for making today's space available to us and helping us bring forward this incredible conversation. So I just want to say to each of you, please keep in touch with CCAR. We're on social media, we have a website, and please stay involved and remain involved. And if you have any questions about anything today or ways to engage further, Jessica London, who's our executive director you met earlier, please reach out to her, or please reach out to me anytime. I'd be happy to talk more about it. I want to say a good afternoon. It's afternoon now. To all of you, have fun this afternoon, and I hope to see many of you tonight in celebration. And again, many, many, many thanks. Thank you.